start. Everyone is here and ready? Good afternoon and welcome to the panel, U.S. Energy Policy Deep Dive. My name is Natalie Kempkey. A little bit about myself. I work at the Energy Information Administration, and I've been elected to the USAEE leadership in the next upcoming year, so I look forward to seeing you all at the next conference. I would like to thank USAEE for inviting me to chair this panel. It's truly an honor. The knowledge and breadth of men and women in this room is truly outstanding. I'm thrilled to have Linda, Kevin, and Melanie speak with us. Their knowledge also is unparalleled. Our topic today will delve into the history and context surrounding the changing landscape of energy policy in the United States and explores the question of how to reconcile the nation's competing energy goals. What will be the trade-offs if necessary? We're going to also build upon this morning's panel, and I think most of you were there for that. And so during that panel, we talked about the evolving energy landscape. Well, now we're going to bring the parallel to that, the evolving energy policy landscape, and see how the two complement and reflect each other. In addition, we talked about the 3 C's this morning: competition, crisis, and consumers. Well, Kevin's going to introduce us to different aspects of the R's and B's, which will also complement this idea that was brought up earlier this morning. So let's go ahead. My comments are going to be very brief so we can get to questions and answers. I feel like there's going to be a lot of that after our speakers. So let me introduce our first panelist, Linda Stuntz. Linda is a founding partner of the law firm of Stuntz, Davis & Stappier, located here in DC. Her practice includes energy and environmental regulation, as well as government support of technology, development, and transfer. Notably, she served as Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy under President George H.W. Bush, helping to develop the Energy Policy Act of 1992. You want to come up and thank you?
So I am not going to use slides because I know you've seen a lot of those today, and I really look forward to the opportunity to just speak with you about something that's been really my whole career, and that's energy policy. First, I should say thank you for having me, Guy, and whoever else was responsible. It's a great privilege for a lawyer, such as myself, to stand before you and be invited to speak to economists. Most of my economic training was on the job, and I have to say I was really fortunate to be mentored by some amazing people, including folks from the private sector. I don't know if any of you out there, I see some old friends remember Ted Eck of Amoco when I was on the Hill. He was, I believe, the chief economist of Amoco at the time, and he would come and explain things to us in ways that were riveting and educational and helped us understand things. And then, of course, was fortunate in my government experience to have a lot of terrific teachers, including Guy Caruso, Howard Runspect, Paul Joskow, Dick Schmalensee, Adam Saminsky, who I remember taught me the difference between backwardation and contango, and what, because they don't teach that in law school. So it became apparent to me very early on, as I entered law practice in 1979, in the middle of the tumultuous 70s, and when I went to the House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee in 1981, in a frenzy of energy legislation, that economics was kind of important. And the relationship between economics and law and policy was pretty interesting and not clear and quite challenging, but something that's basically been my career and that I've enjoyed. And sort of for my lunch, I told my kids that I hope they find something as interesting and satisfying, because it's never been the same. It's changed, the role of technology, the intermix with environmental law. But one thing that was clear amidst all the tumult of the 70s is the goal of energy policy was, and I put quotes around this because I know I'm among economists, and even as a lawyer, I've always understood that energy independence is not an economically sort of sensible proposition. But, and John Jimison sitting in the front row, don't tell that to a politician. That's what we as a country, I would argue, embarked upon in the 70s, which recall, were bad. 2 bad oil embargoes, a lot of inflation, 3 Mile Island accident, which created a great deal of doubt about nuclear power, great sense of insecurity about our own oil supplies because U.S. oil production peaked. All of this sense of fallibility and insecurity culminated in price and allocation controls, actually which started under Mr. Nixon, began to be released under President Carter. Those price and allocation controls, as most any economist, even at the 70s, even at the junior level could tell you, resulted in scarcity and big-time problems. The political reactions to that, some were helpful, deregulation of oil and natural gas, some were not helpful. The Fuel Use Act, the Synthetic Fuels Corporation are just examples, with many bumps along the way. We created a Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That was a part of that. We also, over time, began to move away from command and control regulation toward more reliance on market forces and energy markets. Natural gas, where a lot of folks, energy lawyers in Washington, and a lot of us started out, I think maybe Melanie to some degree as well. It's hard to imagine now, but in the mid-1970s, the nation faced a severe natural gas price shortage. And I know some of you know this well, but as I look out and I think of talking to my family and my kids, I grew up in Ohio, that's where I'm from. And so there were literally, the schools were shut down, factories were closed, there was a shortage of natural gas in the interstate market that was regulated by FERC and the Federal Power Commission. Meanwhile, down in Texas and Louisiana, the intrastate gas market, which was not regulated at the federal level, was in surplus. This created, sort of in some senses, a second Civil War, license plates about, you know, freeze the Yankees in the dark and that sort of thing. But it was recognized, I think, at that point, that federal regulation was no longer feasible, at least in the utility-style regulation of which it had been employed. And so Congress passed in 1978 the Natural Gas Policy Act, which was supposed to provide gradual deregulation in a rational manner, unfortunately setting 27 different categories, not of ice cream, but natural gas, subject to different price ceilings, somewhat amazingly, did solve the gas shortage, but prices kept going up. Because, and Melanie and others will recall, there were certain categories of gas were deregulated first, the price of those which would go up, they became very expensive, deep gas and so forth. So the law of supply and demand was stifled by really a Byzantine technical price control scheme and legacy contracting issues. Congress also outlawed the use of natural gas, and again, don't think today, think about 1981, outlawed the use of natural gas to generate electricity because we needed to save it for petrochemical uses. It was a premium fuel and we didn't have enough. That again was repealed not long after. Complete natural gas development deregulation finally allowed domestic natural gas markets to operate, and with assistance from FERC in freeing up non-discriminatory pipeline access and dealing with some legacy cost issues, I think most would agree, and most case studies, I think, taught in economics today, that natural gas markets work pretty well in the United States. Oil example is somewhat similar. Decontrolled and with repeal of certain punitive public policy measures like the windfall profits tax, U.S. oil producers have responded certainly beyond, I think, the imagination of even the most bullish U.S. oil supply folks. In fact, we've gone from a sort of peak oil production concerns back in the Matt Simmons days to now peak demand challenges, and how long will that go? Now, the reality is the ingenuity of U.S. oil and gas producers and the stimulus provided by higher oil and gas prices accomplished what really seemed impossible. We are producing, and I know Natalie can correct me if I'm wrong on this, we're producing now more oil, I believe, at any time in our history, depending on how you count natural gas liquids, which are what, about over 4 million barrels a day. In fact, I think your colleagues at EIA are now saying U.S. production is likely to exceed both Saudi and Russian production, which, again, I think is unimaginable if you told someone that even a fairly short time ago. In fact, not many in 1982 or 2002 or 2012 would have anticipated sales of Strategic Petroleum Reserve oil to help fund budget deficits, or that we could actually lease unused portions of the SPR caverns, or the president declaring that it was no longer a national priority to conserve oil. Nor would they have predicted the repeal of the oil export ban and a booming LNG export market. I know you've heard a lot about that this morning. I'm not going to say more about that. I'm supposed to be talking about sort of the policy parallel to that. What's clear to those of us on the panel is policy has not been able to keep step with that. It would have been a challenge, and particularly given our fractured governance, that hasn't happened. Now let me give just a moment on electricity market liberalization, since a lot of my time has been spent on that and a lot of others here. It wasn't driven by the same energy independence target, if you will, but it's been more influenced by it, I think, than a lot of folks might know. It came from folks who looked at the success in oil and natural gas markets and said, geez, maybe we should have more choice in electricity markets. Maybe the integrated model for utilities isn't the way to go. There was the success of what was actually a fairly modestly designed law called PURPA. John Jemison knows it well, to increase the use of renewables, actually show that you could have competition in generation. It was the success of technology. Using aeroderivative jet air turbines could actually be changed into turbines to generate electricity. And once we had the natural gas markets fixed, this produced supplies of electricity at low cost, which were a challenge given what was happening in the nuclear area, and given that the Clean Air Act had come on, and so forth. And finally, as I said, so the consumers thought maybe we could benefit from markets as the natural gas and other consumers had. FERC has done a lot of work in that area as well. What's interesting is, and I call it myself sort of electricity markets in purgatory, we haven't been able to make the full transition in electricity that has been made in oil and natural gas. There are structural differences. Most importantly, I would suggest, is the inability to store electricity at scale. It just makes it very different. And those of you who are economists in the room would understand that and why that is, how you can, what effects on the market that has. And indeed, there are a lot of questions around, do we have proper electricity markets? So the question I would pose to you today and to my colleagues, and maybe we can have some fun talking about this later, is where does energy policy go now? As I thought about this, and again, I'm old enough as the elder person on the panel, you know, there was a time when the Cold War there was a Cold War, and it was about tearing down the wall in Berlin. And when that wall came down, and the sort of the evil empire turned not to be what it was, there was a pause as people in the defense community looked around and said, well, what do we do next? What is our next target? And at least it is my perception that we're a little bit there on energy. Now in Washington, it seems to be energy dominance. And we can talk about what that means outside Washington, and I do get outside Washington, thankfully. It's pretty much decarbonization, and I think that is appropriate. As those seeking energy independence have learned, however, energy affordability, technological capabilities and availability, and the reliability of supply of energy are sort of foundational concepts that have to be taken into account in any solutions or any strategies that you want to deploy to get to that energy objective. And importantly, unlike the energy security battle, where I would submit we used market forces as a whole to attain that objective in a pretty amazing way, we're not doing that as much on the decarbonization agenda. If we were, the preferred method, of course, would be carbon taxes. And those have not been very widespread, and they have not been set at levels that I think are effective. And again, I don't think there's a lot of dispute about that. Now, there are those, in Washington in particular, who say the objective of energy policy is still energy independence. We're just morphing it a bit or redefining it to mean cyber and physical security. Security of the grid, including fuel security, not oil import dependence. This is where you get the administration's Resilience Initiative, which focuses on fuel-secure electricity generation resources. One could look at that as an attempt to sort of reset the balance between affordability, security, and environmental considerations by elevating security in a world of cyber warfare. On the flip side, to the extent you are reducing reliance on markets, or at least for electricity, at states and potentially imposing choices that those markets, imperfect though they may be, are not producing, you again are moving beyond methods that have in the past proven successful. So So let me wrap up here with a sort of a conclusion, at least of my career so far, that with respect to energy policy question, what have we learned and where are we now? I think what I have learned, I would submit, is that government cannot repeal the laws of supply and demand, but it can, and it has, and it probably will in the future, suppress and distort them to achieve public policy objectives or to address externalities. Now, externalities have always been discussed with energy policy. They are not new. There were, for years, advocates for oil import fees who said we need to internalize the external costs imposed by reliance on imported oil. The way to do that's an oil import fee. And it's always the case, identifying an externality that is truly external, two, deciding that that externality requires government intervention, and three, determining the scope of that intervention, how to do that intervention in a way that accomplishes what you want it to without even worse adverse consequences is very difficult. And I could come up with examples of where governments tried and failed to do that. But we've entered a new era where the focus of energy policy is no longer energy independence, but it's either energy dominance or decarbonization or grid fuel security or all of them at once. Again, and I think Melanie will get into this, new technology is going to be essential to make these seemingly incompatible objectives achievable. Moreover, without more consensus around what the objective of energy policy really is, it's going to be very difficult to make progress, right? It's going to be difficult to direct resources to where they need to go. And as I said, some of these are almost mutually exclusive. So, and I also think unless there is more dedication to looking at market mechanisms, it's unlikely we're going to actually make a lot of progress in achieving any of these objectives. So with that, I will stop and go to my colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. Two quick housekeeping notes that I wanted to say. We'll take questions at the end of all the presentations, so don't worry about walking up to the microphone yet. Just hold your questions to the end. We've got plenty of time. And also, I was supposed to say this and I forgot. Even though I work for the Energy Information Administration, it is a policy-neutral part of DOE, and any comments I say about policy or questions I ask are my own and not reflective of an official EIA view, okay? So now I'm going to introduce Melanie. Melanie Kenderdine is a principal at the Energy Futures Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Before this, she was the director of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, EPSA, under DOE Secretary Ernie Moniz. Actually, Lord, you were the boss of mine before I worked for EIA, so it's great to see her again. She also helped establish the MIT Energy Initiative while she was at MIT. So, Melanie, come on up.
Just move through the, it's not here. I don't know how to do this. Thank you, Natalie, and I would, apropos to the lunchtime speaker, Linda and I have basically grown up together, and I remember meeting with Linda. I was Bill Richardson's chief of staff, and she was Energy Committee minority staff, and she was pregnant. Seems like a lot, and so she worked while she was expecting. I took my 5-month-old son to the Clinton campaign headquarters in New York, and so we came up the hard way, and when we were younger. I'm going to talk about some trends, and they're not going to be in any particular order, but I think that these are some of the things that we need to be considering as we move forward on energy policy. And start out with some overarching trends, changes in our supply profile. Linda alluded to that. I was at DOE for 8 years of the Clinton administration, 4 years of Obama. Coming in the Obama administration, right before I came down, the White House was calling, and we were working on issues. We issued the first LNG export permit, and one of the first things I did when I went to work in Congress when I was young was to try and get the Fuel Use Act repealed. So we made a lot of progress, and then we approved oil exports as well. Shift from resource to technology-based energy systems. That's where your resource is free, your wind and solar don't have a cost to them, but there is a significant technology requirement and cost as well. That's what that's about. Digitalization, not unrelated, big data analytics and smart systems, electrification and electricity dependence, demographics, urbanization, the emergence of smart cities. I'm not quite sure how emerging they are yet, but we're looking at that. And decarbonization of the electricity sector due to flat demand and our changing fuel mix. And these are the trends in and affecting energy systems. Boundary conditions are, however, substantial. The energy industry, a multi-trillion-dollar per year, highly capitalized commodity business with exquisite supply chains. That's not my word, it is a quote from a paper that Ernie wrote. We've asked him what that means, okay? And established customer bases providing essential services at all levels of society leads to a system with considerable inertia, aversion to risk, extensive regulation, and complex politics. Linda's talked a fair amount about energy security, and when I was at DOE under Obama, we had the Russian incursion into Ukraine. Really significant concern for our allies in Europe at that point in time, and I went to Secretary Moniz and thought we needed a bit of an update on what energy security really was. We went to Rome with these principles, and then they were adopted by the leaders in Brussels a little bit later. Flexible, transparent, competitive energy markets, we considered a principle for energy security. Infrastructure modernization for energy system resilience. Energy fuel sources of supply and routes be diversified. That was particularly relevant to Ukraine at that time and Europe. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Accelerating transition to a low carbon energy economy as key contributors to energy security, energy efficiency, deployment of clean and sustainable energy technologies, and emergency response systems. Very, very different than the oil-centric definition of energy security that I grew up with and that most people are familiar with. And so this is what we looked at. I don't know how it is being treated. It was G7 and EU, adopted by all of the leaders of the G7 and EU, and it's a little bit changed right now. This really is about looking at our supply chains and thinking differently about supply chains. If you're going to variable renewables, batteries become key. You can see there, the purple is lithium-ion batteries. And we have fundamentally done a down select to lithium-ion batteries in this country. And that has supply chain implications. Here's why. You can see the countries there. The main reserves of lithium are Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, China, and Australia. Australia has been buying up, or China's been buying up Australian lithium mines. So that is a significant concentration of resources. It will take time to develop additional resources. You can produce lithium from brine. They're doing that in Chile and Argentina. I've looked at other brine formations in the world to see how many others there might be. It's a very specific geologic formation, and really it's just Utah and the Dead Sea that I found that were appropriate formations for producing lithium from brine. And then cobalt, another key component of lithium-ion batteries, really is only produced in, right now, mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So as a child of the OPEC era, looking at concentration of resources like this suggests a lot of things to me about supply chains and what we need to be thinking about. That orange there is 2015 and 2025 just for electric vehicles. And you all know that lithium is used in many other things. That's prices. Lithium and cobalt prices have gone up dramatically. They've fallen a little bit recently, but I looked this morning, lithium prices are going back up again. Here's something else we need to be thinking about strategically. These are the 20 most populous countries in 2015 and what the forecasts are for 2050. And what you can see there, Nigeria becomes the third most populous country on the planet. The US falls to fourth. Right now we are third. Nigeria has a landmass about 1/6 the size of the United States. I was in Rwanda in July of this year. The median age in Rwanda is 15.8 years. That's median age, and I think you see that in a lot of African countries. You can see Congo goes from 79 to 195. Egypt, 88 million to 151. India becomes the most populous country in the world. China actually loses a little population, and the ones in yellow are the ones that lose population. And I look at India, and we met with them many times when we were at DOE. I went over there. They are sitting on a pile of lignite on the Indian continent, and their population is growing dramatically. We need to figure out how they can use that and empower the country. One more thing about Africa. As I said, I was in Rwanda. I was also in Kenya giving a talk, and I looked at rural electrification in Rwanda. In Africa, Sierra Leone, 3%. Burkina Faso, 1%. Rural electrification numbers are extremely low, and that's going to place huge demands on energy resources going forward as well. This is after the administration said it was going to exit Paris, which it can do, I think the day after Election Day in 2020, formally they can exit. There are many states, cities, counties, etc., that made commitments to meet Paris targets. The dark green are the 22 states that made commitments to Paris. The lighter green are the states did not make commitments to Paris, meaning Paris Agreement, but the largest cities in the state did. Texas, it's Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, and one other one I can't remember. So 5 of the largest cities in Texas have committed to meeting Paris agreements. 246 institutions of higher learning have committed to meeting the Paris agreements, and 1,600 companies. 60% of Fortune 500 companies already have commitments to clean energy, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, or energy efficiency. 120 major companies are committed to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and then here a year ago, the global oil and gas companies in the U.S. formed a consortium to put $1 billion into reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. So you put this up against what's happened in the world. 195 countries now committed to meeting Paris targets, and companies committed to Paris targets. It says a couple of things: that there is a global market for clean energy technologies. We need to be able to take advantage of that, whether you believe in climate or not. It's commerce, and I'll show you a little bit more on that in a second. So that is hugely important. The other thing I would say about this, it's nice that 22 states have committed to meet Paris targets. I have no idea what the baseline is for that and how that might be measured. And so that's an analytical concern we need to be thinking about. Global energy investment, 2017. What's interesting here, for the second time in 2 years, investments in electricity have exceeded investments in oil and gas combined. We have coal up there at the top. If you take the coal supply out, you will see that electricity is the #1 investment, and it has always been oil and gas until the last 2 years. What you see there also, renewables is over twice as much as fossil fuel generation. So when I talk about clean energy markets, that's what I mean. You can see that. One other thing I would say, nuclear, $32 billion 2016, now $17 billion in 2017. Nuclear is a very, very small piece of electricity investment relative to others. And then here you can look at energy efficiency, and the most investment is in buildings. I would say that industry is the most difficult, and we need to focus on that because industry is also the most difficult to decarbonize. This is by country, the same data by some countries and regions that we looked at. China, I just have China and the US, that orange is China, green is US. Here's upstream oil and gas, where we are almost twice as much as the Chinese. You go over here to renewables. China's almost $100 billion investment in renewables, and we are down around $40 billion in the US. China is putting its money in renewables at a much greater pace than we are. Here you have electricity networks. They are outpacing us, but they need to electrify, and so they are putting in their systems in China. The one thing I would say about that, we are updating ours, that they have more modern electricity grid than we do as they are building out their grid. And then finally, efficiency. The Chinese are also outpacing the US substantially. This is another supply chain issue. The red is pipeline gas, and those are total volumes, okay, BCF by region. Then you have LNG. These are volumes by region, I believe, in 2016. And so what? And this is new LNG. Okay, substantially substantial. That will be in place by 2020. What this one shows is that by 2020, LNG volumes will exceed pipeline gas volumes. Okay, it says to me a lot of things about supply chains and protecting choke points and et cetera, et cetera. But it means that LNG supply chains for U.S. exporters and our allies will rise in importance. I don't know why importance is black there. And then I'd say one other thing about supply chains. We widened the Panama Canal. I was in Panama about 6 or 7 months ago. Before the widening, only 23 of 420 LNG vessels could move through it. And now 90% can move through it. That takes about 42% off the time for our LNG to go to Asia, although we just the Chinese just put a tariff on LNG, U.S. LNG today, I think. And but we are, it is important to our producers. I mentioned technology-based energy systems bringing new players into the markets. We looked at energy data analytics, building energy management, smart cities and grid, global drones, energy and cybersecurity. Many of your conventional players on this list. Okay, National Grid, I'm trying to find another one. Cisco, etc., GE, Siemens are on here. But there are a whole bunch of players on this list that we don't think of as traditional energy players. When I go to a trade association meeting with energy people, you don't see these represented necessarily. And so we need to acknowledge that, the organizations need to acknowledge the huge interest in new players in the market. They also need technology, policy, and analytical support. Switching, this is from QAR 1.2, which we did on electricity from generation to end use. And we always pride ourselves for 99.9% reliable, et cetera, et cetera. The definition of reliability is changing for electricity. And you have over here on the far right, you've got carbon goals, that's on the decadal scale. You've got capacity markets, annual scale, hours and days. When you start looking at the requirements of the new systems, largely brought on by variable renewables, but a couple other things I'll show you here in a minute, you get down to the millisecond requirements for reliability. It's a very different way to look at reliability than we have in the past of our grid. This is a survey of data centers. They were asked, 538 of them, or however, that's members of Congress, but 500 and something, were asked how long it took them to lose value if they lost electricity. What you see here is 17, 34, 43% said they lost value for their companies immediately. Another, if they lost electricity at all, another measure of reliability, an economic measure of reliability. This is a cartoon that shows how our electricity systems have changed. I put myself up there as the Kenderdine utility. And this is how it used to work. You had one-way flows, you had your industrial customers, your residential customers, your commercial consumers here. This is how it's working now. It's incredibly complicated grid operations, okay? And the two-way flows mean that the 60 billion or so devices that we have now connected through all of these consumer options that we have in the world. We connected, I think, about 60 billion devices in 2009. The number of devices in the world exceeded people in the world that were connected to the grid. Places a lot of pressure on grid operators, very complex grid operations. They need to be able to see this much more than they can. They need automation of their substations here, critical improvements. I think it should be part of any infrastructure package if we can ever get one passed. And then the communication between the distribution and transmission system, which is a problem from a cybersecurity perspective. It's also a problem from a jurisdictional perspective because the federal jurisdiction ends at that point and at the state line, and national security is the #1 responsibility of the federal government, I believe. These are the lifeline networks and the interdependencies between them. I won't read them. You can see what's happening here. What I would say is the details of what's used for what. Transportation, fuel transport and shipping, natural gas, fossil fuel for generators, electricity and when I forgot one here, electricity and communications are connected to all of them, as is finance. I just do the animation myself and I forgot to put finance on here, and so I stuck it on at the end. So finance is connected to all, communications and electricity connected to all of our lifeline networks, but finance and communications rely on electricity. This is illustrating Linda raised the issue of cybersecurity. I will again as well. We are not legally capable of dealing with that right now because of the divide between federal and state jurisdictions by law. So I think that it is a serious problem. I would also say another thing, we set up a strategic petroleum reserve when one sector of our economy depended on oil. Now every sector of our economy depends on electricity, and you cannot store it at scale. And the batteries that we have chosen to use to store it at any kind of scale, we have a concentration of suppliers for those batteries. So I think it's we need to be very, very mindful of what we're doing. Like I just mentioned, electricity is a critical asset. This is the Mirai botnet attack. It affected 164 countries from baby monitors, the attack. And you also saw in Ukraine 3 distribution systems that were taken down by a Russian hacking. And this is just Center for Naval Analysis talking about the importance of electricity. A couple other things. I've looked at innovation ecosystems when I was at DOE, and we are looking at that now as well. They are not evenly distributed in the country. I should have mentioned that our population goes from 320 to 390 million in the United States. The rural population stays flat. So we grow by 70 million, none of it is in rural America. It's either flat or declining. And so I looked at here, this is the percent of a population without broadband internet. It's the greatest in the dark blue areas. and I'm speaking at a co-op next Tuesday in Lubbock, and it roughly maps onto the electric co-ops, and we need to be supporting broadband in rural America, or they're not going to have any opportunities for economic development that come with broadband development. This is just a little flight of fancy of mine. I've been preaching about this for years. This is the current DOE organizational structure. You have your RPE and your loan program over here. The Undersecretary, well, forget the Undersecretary for Science and Energy, they don't have that, but our programs at DOE are organized around fuels. That is very 1970s. It's a very fuels organizational structure. And which office is responsible for distributed generation? There's not a good fit. Where would you put an energy and water program? The appropriations for DOE is energy and water. There is no home in DOE for an energy and water program. Why is efficiency in the renewables office? You are by and large talking about the efficient use of fossil fuels, okay, because they're 85%, 84% of our fuels. Where would you migrate basic science discoveries to technology solutions in this structure? Where does transportation fit? What about transportation fuels? What about electric vehicles? Electric vehicles, I place an ADR rating, but we have an Office of Electricity, which we did not have when I was at DOE my first 8 years as an appointee in Clinton, and we didn't have an Office of Electricity, and which we noticed at some point when we were doing portfolio planning. And is there any significant relationship between vehicle building and industrial efficiency technologies? I would say hydrogen, actually, but any rate, you get the point. And can we develop comprehensive research policy portfolio when our offices are organized around fuels? I really think we need to rethink, given what I've just shown on the trends, rethink the organization of the department in a very significant way. And this is just a few questions at the end. Are our investments aligned with our changing energy profile? Are we creating global opportunities in clean energy investment for our companies? Are we engaging the right players? Are we paying enough attention to and protecting supply chains? Look at the Panama Canal, look at what's moving around the world in LNG and where the lithium and cobalt supplies are. Are we aligning players' programs and policies to accelerate clean energy innovation? Are we putting our federal dollars in the right place? And are we leaving people behind? And if so, will they impede progress? How would we engage all Americans in a clean energy transition? So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Next up, we have Kevin Book. Kevin co-founded Clearview Energy Partners that covers oil, natural gas, refined products, and coal policy. He has also testified before several House and Senate committees and appears frequently in print and media broadcasts. So many of you have probably
Okay. Well, I am getting to my presentation here, which I think I can figure out how to do with enough time. You probably noticed there's something different between me and the other speakers on the panel. Not what you think it is. They are all practitioners in some form of energy policy. I am merely an analyst of it. And so I've never had a government role to make energy policy. I have, however, put a lot of time into thinking about how it works. And so what I'm going to give you today, if technology will cooperate, is about the 15th iteration of a framework that I started about a decade and a half ago. And it's to answer the question, how's all this stuff work? So for those of you who've been waiting for an opportunity to sleep, I promise this will not be the opportunity. I'm going to go very quickly through some slides. But the first one, assuming I can go through this slide. Now we have an interesting problem. Well, this will be a different presentation without the slides. Could you pass my flash drive and maybe we'll try Plan B? So I'm going to try Plan B on the fly and see if this works. Apologies, guys. Hello, sir. Thank you all for humming among yourselves in that brief interlude. There will be still not working, yeah. There we go. All right. Finally, at long last. The first slide says, don't listen to me, I'm probably wrong, don't invest based on what I say, and please God, don't make a life decision based on it. However, I'm going to go through 5 R's, which are not the R's you might be thinking about when we talk about politics and policy. Regional nature of energy policy, reactivity of the laws that are written, the regulatory execution of those laws, the reinterpretation of those laws because Congress is stuck, and the review in courts of those reinterpretations. And yes, then the D's, if the R's were attributes, the D's are sort of the eras in recent memory. The Diversification Era, it's interesting, it's not on this screen, it's on that one, so that's fine. Diversification Era, which I'll start at about 2003, a good solid 15 years ago, going through to the, let's call it the Economic Development Era with the collapse of Lehman Brothers about 10 years ago, going through to the Decarbonization Era, which I will start conveniently with President Obama's second term when he pivoted his agenda into decarbonization, into the deregulation era, and yes, I suppose, even though it invokes something of a dog park image, the dominance era. So, the R's first. We live in a very diverse country, but I mean that from a resource basis. Whether one is talking about the amount of money per capita, DPI, that goes to oil, to gasoline, home heating, and power, whether we're talking about the amount that spending increases with a carbon tax, whether we're talking about energy shares of GDP at a state level, the upstream share of that, whether we're talking about the export share of GDP at a state level, state generation from coal, gas, nuclear energy, or non-hydro renewables, whether we're talking about the national share of oil production. Hey, Texas, look at that. Oh, hey, look at that, North Dakota. Or whether we're talking about onshore gas, or for that matter, coal. Hi, Wyoming. Whether we're talking about capacity shutdowns of coal plants, a fairly current topic. Whether we're talking about, oh yes, corn production, and with it, ethanol nameplate, or refinery capacity, or let's face it, automobile registrations in the context of CAFE, probably a new topic. A lot of diversity of resources, different regions. So what I'm about to say is going to shock you. If you look at how people in our representative democracy vote, they vote for what's in the ground in their home states. To derive the conclusion that politics is local takes a lot of work. You're welcome to do it yourselves. You take a database of resources and compare it against a database of votes, and what you find is that about 70% of the time, members of Congress vote for what's in the ground at home, and that's at a 2% significance level relative to sort of the average state against the average nation. Okay, so that's useful information. Why? Well, because it tells you that there's a fragmented resource base and a democratic process that has to pull all that together. Now, that's not to say that it is an entirely regional dynamic. There are some partisan attributes, and they're kind of intriguing. If you look at that pocket share that goes to energy, and then you look at the states that voted on a two-party basis for Trump in 2016, call them red states, because that's what everyone does, and you line them up from high to low spending, more of the states on the left-hand side are red. And if you do the same thing for how their carbon exposure looks, more of the states are red on the left side. And if you look at the states at a production profile basis as a share of the national total, most of the producer states are red. Oh, and let's see, if you look at the fossil share of electricity on the grid within the states, you will see that red states are more fossil-based in their energy mix, and blue states actually more blue, more hydro-based in theirs. So there's a lot underlying those numbers. The resource bases are where they are, and the politics on top of them are where they are. However, the nature of long-distance drivers on lower disposable incomes, I'm looking at a ratio on a spending basis. Those red states happen to also comport with a lot of the politics, the sort of the populist message that got Donald Trump elected. So they're not entirely uncorrelated. In any case, this is quite a lot. You have an energy law that requires people from different resource bases to cohere with or fight against their party orthodoxy. Very complicated thing to do, so one tends not to do it unless they're reacting to something bad. And that brings me to some of the scarcity. Linda mentioned a natural gas shortage as a driver of national law. Well, yeah, there's been a lot of shortages, spills, and otherwise bad things. On the environmental side, most of the energy moving outside of its immediate value chain and hurting somebody. That tends to get you a law a lot of the time. So just a handful of some of them. Disruptions get you things like the Energy Policy and Conservation Act on the last slide, or the Energy Security Act on this one. And some of the more recent vintage disruptions, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, really not an oil issue so much as a power issue, propelled that across the finish line in a lot of ways. And so this dynamic generally tends to be reactive but lagging, and that's because the pain of pulling together one of these laws, again, those of you who have worked on the Hill and have had to cobble them together to get provisions that can cross the finish line, takes time, and it's generally, in a lot of cases, not until the pain of inaction exceeds the pain of acting, the difficult political challenges, that you get your energy laws. Intriguingly, you get a lot of energy policy in the form of tax law, and so there's been many that have delivered significant and meaningful policy outcomes. But it's also notable there are instances when my rule gets broken, because they're made to be broken, and so things like the Macondo spill don't produce a reaction at all. Maybe that speaks to the nature of how Congress was working at that particular time in our politics as a nation. Anyway, okay, resources, regional, reactive laws. So who has to do all the work once these laws are passed? Well, the regulators do. And regulatory agencies have many stripes and colors. I, however, am an analyst who speaks to people with short attention spans. So I have two categories, enabling and limiting. And that isn't probably fair. Enabling meaning pro-business, limiting meaning protecting. And in many ways, agencies have different characters across both categories. However, there are some that would surprise you. The Commerce Department's about commerce, right? Yes, well, maybe. Except the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has an essentially limiting environmental protection character. If you look at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, sounds like safety, right? But essentially, moving freight safely is about moving freight, and so it has an essentially enabling character. These folks are responsible for interpreting what laws meant when they were written, and sometimes things have elapsed since they were written. The major fundamental changes of the last 10 years are about as night and day on energy as you can get. And yet the laws are still mostly the same, which means that the Obama administration principally had to do the creative work of reinterpreting old statutes for new circumstances. And when they did, well, yeah, you probably know how this story goes. That sort of thing tends to get sued a lot around here, which is not to say that there's anything bad about people getting sued. Challenging things in courts is precisely how our system is supposed to work. And so it is with caution that I will offer the next slide. It is not a good idea to judge a jurist by the nominating president's party. That is not a good representation by any means of the many different types of jurisprudential theory that go into what makes a judge or justice think the way he or she does. However, as it turns out, that's one of the data sets that we have. And so if you look at the political nature of nominations to the courts, to the extent that there are agencies that may be more enabling or more limiting, and that there are presidents whose regulators may have strayed outside of those natures, when it goes to court, whether or not the judges are on the court more or less likely to agree with that interpretation of law does matter. It is mattering. It mattered in the Obama administration. It will matter in the Trump administration too, as the deregulation ultimately goes to court just like the regulations that preceded it. Okay, so that was 5 hours, pretty quick after our little delay, the humming break. So regional, reactive, regulatory, reinterpretation review, there's your 5 R's. The D's. Okay, really the first D, which I didn't put in here, was deprivation. If I take my time scale back to the 70s, that was really the original D that in the modern era of energy policy defined so many of our policies. But instead, I'm going to start with President George W. Bush eating his favorite fuel. So this is the beginning of the diversification era. How has diversification worked? Well, I would contend that in the 70s and 80s, a lot of oil and petroleum fell out of the stationary sectors more or less completely for power, and pretty much for a lot of the fuel and energy process needs for the industrial sector. Even home heating customers everywhere except for a few homes in New England still have largely moved out of petroleum. But, as it turns out, transportation had not done very much of anything until the Energy Policy Act of 2005 mandated the inclusion of ethanol into gasoline. And yes, as Linda mentioned, the command and control side was at work here much more than the market basis, although it is a tradable credit program. What you see is a rapid diffusion of ethanol into the gasoline mix as the red line jumps up. Source of a lot of discussions. I'm sure you're going to have some this week. On the green side of things, I've divided my 4 eras by the markers I gave you. And really the inflection point in the diversification of the grid also happened during the Bush administration. There were federal tax policies that emerged at that point in time, also state renewable portfolio standards, and it did happen to coincide with a very fundamental change, which was the flooding of the solar market by China, which enabled a lot of diffusion pretty much with the start of the Recovery Act, but even in some of the years that preceded it. So one of the things about these eras I've done, it's a little artificial because they don't start and end at the signposts I've given you. They keep going. You can see the greening up that started then, accelerated, and has continued to this day. And in some ways, one of the ironies of President Obama's presidency may have been that he came to Washington from an energy policy perspective to transform the energy portfolio, particularly transportation fuels. He had a vision for electric vehicles that were articulated broadly, still hasn't been reached. But it was oil and gas that transformed the reality of his presidency because it was so economically useful from a development perspective. And so it is that when we start the collapse of Lehman Brothers development era, I've chosen the picture of President Obama standing in front of pipe for, yes, the Keystone Pipeline. As it would turn out, the Council of Economic Advisors, 2 years after this picture was taken, would report that the oil and gas sector was responsible for 22 basis points of GDP in an economy that desperately needed it. In other words, whatever you might have felt ideologically, it's your economy to run. And if something's growing fast, and actually energy is not a particularly labor-intensive business in any part of the portfolio, but this part was growing like gangbusters. And so it made a big difference at a national level. In fact, one way to think about this is to trend down with unemployment from that 10% national rate, red, going down to below 4 now, and to look at the shares of non-farm payrolls that the upstream and services sectors made up on a monthly basis. Those blue bumps, and you can see them on the left-hand side, show individual months where 5 or even 10% of jobs were coming from the oil and gas upstream. As it would turn out, a price collapse in 2014 changed that dynamic and put the jobs multiplier in reverse. That did not help necessarily the political clout of the oil and gas industry in Washington as an economy was recovering and diversifying in its own right to have such a big jobs engine suddenly shutting down. Also, one might argue that actually solving scarcity could have hurt them politically as well. Lawmakers aren't nearly as afraid of oil and gas running out as they once were, evidenced in part perhaps by the 6 laws selling 300 million barrels of strategic oil for money that have come out in the last 4 years. But I digress. You can see the blue bumps, by the way, have popped up again with recovery in oil prices in recent months. But something to say for the fact that the economy is much more well and broadly recovered than it was then, and so the political impact of those jobs is probably less. Same president, different picture. Decarbonization. In June 2013, President Obama picked a particularly hot day to introduce his Climate Action Plan. The Climate Action Plan was a suite of sectoral and really sort of a broader vision of how to interpret existing law, to use the Clean Air Act, pen and phone style, to modify the status quo, to reduce the carbon intensity of the U.S. economy. Now, arguably, on a fundamental basis, the power sector is the poster child, right? The massive decarbonization of the power sector over the 15-year interval that I've picked here from 2002 to 17. I waited for complete data, so yeah, my first 15-year interval was 03, my second 15-year interval is 02. You can fault me, but I can't make 2018 end any faster. So